This 8-month period, it's just, well, it's mind-boggling, isn't it? We're diving deep into Russia, 1917, from the February collapse of the Tsarist regime, something ancient, to the world's first communist state just, what, 8 months later?
It really is history accelerated. You've got Tsar Nicholas II forced out after massive demonstrations in Petrograd, that's the capital city.
Right.
And then, bang, by October, the Bolsheviks are in charge. It's a dramatic, almost clinical takeover in the end.
And that's what I really want to get into. How does this group, the Bolsheviks, who were like basically underground, kind of fringe at the start of the year,
Yeah, definitely not the main players initially.
how do they end up seizing power by October? It seems almost impossible.
Yeah.
So our mission today is really to trace that specific rise, focusing on Petrograd.
And before we really get going, one crucial thing for you listening, dates. We talk about the October Revolution, but because Russia used the Julian calendar then.
Ah, right, the calendar difference.
Exactly. It was 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar used in the West. So October for them was actually early November for us.
Good point. Keeps the naming, but shifts the timing. Okay, so early 1917, Tsar's gone. What happens next? Who steps in?
Well, initially you get the provisional government, the PG. It's seen, at first anyway, as the legitimate sort of liberal democratic authority.
Okay, makes sense, like a caretaker government.
Sort of, but its power was instantly complicated by something called dual power. Because alongside the PG, you had the Soviets.
The councils, right? Workers, soldiers, peasants, deputies.
Precisely. And they held a lot of the real grassroots power, especially in Petrograd. But here's the kicker you mentioned.
The Bolsheviks weren't running the Soviets yet.
Not at all. The majority in the Soviets early on were moderate socialists, Mensheviks, and the socialist revolutionaries, the SRs.
And they had a different idea about the revolution's pace.
Yeah, they generally thought Russia needed a bourgeois liberal phase first. So you had this unstable setup, the PG as the official government, but the Soviet holding a kind of veto power, it couldn't last.
Okay, so let's pinpoint where things really start to unravel for the PG and maybe swing toward the radicals. April 1917 seems key. Lenin's back.
Yes. Lenin's return from exile in April is a major turning point. He completely changes the Bolshevik tune.
How so? Weren't they already revolutionary?
Well, yes, but many leading Bolsheviks inside Russia, people like Kamenev, were thinking more along the lines of pushing the provisional government from the left, maybe strong socialist influence within it.
Okay.
Lenin arrives and says, no, absolutely not. He calls for the immediate overthrow of the bourgeois PG. He wants a direct path to socialist revolution, breaking that dual power system entirely.
That's a pretty radical shift, even for them. But why did it find such fertile ground? Why were people listening by then?
It really comes down to conditions on the ground. Economics, mostly. The provisional government was failing, pretty spectacularly, to deliver on the big promises. Peace, land reform.
The war was still dragging on.
Exactly. And the economy was just tanking. You had severe shortages of raw materials, distribution networks, rivers, railways were a mess.
And food.
Critical problem. Peasants were starting to refuse to sell their grain because the paper money they got in return was becoming worthless. Hyperinflation.
And if we look at the workers in Petrograd, you mentioned about 390,000, a third of them women. The numbers are just stark, aren't they?
They really are. Nominal wages might have shot up, on paper, but prices for everything shot up even faster.
So real wages actually dropped.
Plummeted, down to maybe a third of what they were before the war. People were desperate. Economic despair, it fuels radicalism faster than anything.
Makes sense. And the Bolsheviks were structured to take advantage of this.
In a way, yes. Their structure was interesting. You had the Central Committee, the CC, setting the overall policy. But local groups, especially the Petersburg Committee and, crucially, the military organization.
That focused on the soldiers.
Right. They had a lot of independence. They could adapt tactics to local conditions, react quickly to the mood on the streets.
And that local independence really comes into play with the next big crisis, doesn't it? The July Days uprising.
Absolutely. July 3rd to 5th. This was this huge kind of spontaneous explosion of anger from workers and soldiers in Petrograd.
Driven by that economic despair and frustration with the PG.
Exactly. What's really fascinating, though, is that the Bolshevik Central Committee, the top leadership, actually tried to stop it on July 3rd. They thought it was too soon, too risky.
Really? So the leadership was hesitant.
But the local Bolsheviks, especially the military organization, again, they are much closer to the groundswell. They helped organize it. And then the Petersburg Committee endorsed it. Bolshevik slogans were all over the banners.
So it suggests the leadership was maybe a bit disconnected from the raw anger of their supposed base. The street was ahead of the party.
I think that's fair to say, yeah. It showed the real energy was coming from below, but the uprising failed. The PG and the moderate Soviet leadership cracked down hard.
And the narrative was immediate. This was an anarchist Bolshevik plot.
Yes, condemned across the board by the establishment. Rumors flew. Right-wing papers had a field day. Malenkaya Gazeta called it the second and great Azovshchina, referring to a famous czarist double agent.
Wow.
Even Georgy Plekhanov, a respected old social democrat, demanded it be crushed urgently, definitively, and ruthlessly. He linked it to German agents.
So the Bolsheviks became public enemy number one overnight. Arrests followed.
Oh, yeah. The PG ordered key figures arrested. Lenin and Zinoviev managed to go underground into hiding. But Kamenev, Trotsky, who wasn't formally a Bolshevik yet, but was closely aligned Lunatarsky, they were all jailed.
And the repression wasn't just arrests, it was public humiliation, too.
Definitely. Alexandra Kollontai, returning from abroad, was detained, and crowds called her a German spy. The prisoners faced poor conditions, abuse. It really looked like the Bolsheviks might be finished. Done.
They seemed completely neutralized, jailed or in hiding, but then comes this incredible reversal of fortune, the Kornilov affair in late August.
Exactly. History turns on a dime sometimes. So after the July days, Kerensky, who is now prime minister, formed a new coalition government, trying to balance socialists and liberals.
But the right wing saw an opportunity.
They did. Various right-wing groups started working with military leaders, pushing for a dictatorship to restore order, crush the radicals, and their man was General Lov Kornilov.
The new commander-in-chief.
Right. Kornilov started making demands: restore the death penalty at the front, clamp down on soldiers' committees, limit political activity in the army. Basically, he was saying the PG was too weak.
And then he makes his move.
In late August, yeah, Kornilov starts moving troops towards Petrograd, seemingly intending to disperse the Soviet and possibly overthrow the PG, or at least force it into establishing a military dictatorship with him in charge.
Panic in the capital.
Total panic. And here's the incredible irony. Kerensky, fearing Kornilov, panicked. Who did he appeal to for help in defending the revolution?
The Bolsheviks. The same people he'd just thrown in jail.
The very same. He allowed the Bolshevik Red Guards to be armed. The Bolsheviks, still technically persecuted, suddenly positioned themselves as the saviors of Petrograd, the true defenders against counter-revolution.
What a turnaround. Kerensky looks weak and possibly complicit. The liberals associated with Kornilov are tainted, and the Bolsheviks emerge looking like heroes.
Precisely, and you see it immediately in the numbers. Those Petrograd City Duma elections in late August. A massive swing to the Bolsheviks.
Oh, big.
They got nearly 200,000 votes, came in second only to the SRs, gained 67 seats. Their support jumped 14% just since May. As one newspaper put it, their forced silence after July had become their finest propaganda. Suppressing them just made them more popular when the real threat seemed to come from the right.
So from near destruction to a huge political boost almost overnight.
Okay, now we're into September, October. The PG is clearly floundering. The question is who takes over and how. This leads to another split within the Bolsheviks themselves, right?
A critical one. Lenin, still in hiding, is now bombarding the Central Committee with letters, demanding an immediate armed uprising. Now is the time, he insists.
But not everyone agreed.
Far from it. Key figures back in Petrograd, Kamenev, Zinoviev again, others like Volodarsky, they were strongly against it.
Why? They just had this huge surge in popularity.
Fear. They remember the July days disaster. They worried the party didn't have enough reliable military support outside the capital. Volodarsky warned the army was exhausted. It wouldn't fight a revolutionary war for them. They feared acting alone would isolate them, provoke a crackdown, maybe even a civil war they couldn't win, risking everything.
A repeat of July, but potentially much worse. Exactly. They feared total annihilation. Yet, while the leadership is arguing, that slogan, all power to the Soviets, keeps getting stronger on the streets.
And we need to be clear what that meant to people at the time.
Yes. For the average worker, soldier, sailor in Petrograd, all power to the Soviets didn't necessarily mean a Bolshevik dictatorship. Not yet.
It meant what? Kicking out the PG and having a government of all the socialist parties in the Soviets.
That seems to be the popular understanding, yes. A government committed to immediate peace, land distribution, workers' control. A broad democratic socialist coalition realized through the Soviets.
Meanwhile, Kerensky's attempts to create some kind of stable alternative, like the Democratic State Conference, they just failed.
Utterly. It ended in confusion. They voted for coalition with bourgeois elements, but against including the Cadets, the main Liberal Party, now tainted by Kornilov. It led to this toothless pre-parliament that satisfied nobody. It just highlighted the power vacuum.
Which the Bolsheviks, despite their internal arguments, were poised to fill. Enter the Military Revolutionary Committee, the MRC.
Right. Established by the Petrograd Soviet in early October. Officially, its purpose was defensive, to coordinate the defense of Petrograd against Germans, yes, but also against rumored plans by Kerensky to move revolutionary garrison troops out of the city.
A convenient pretext.
Very convenient. It was formally headed by a left SR, Lazimir, giving it a non-party appearance. But the key operatives were Bolsheviks Trotsky, Antonov Ovsenko, Podvoisky. It quickly became the Bolsheviks' tool for planning the offensive.
Okay, so the stage is set. The arguments are happening. The MRC is organizing. Let's get to the actual seizure of power. October 24th, 25th. Who makes the first move?
Ironically, it's the provisional government. On the morning of October 24th, Kerensky ordered military cadets officer trainees to raid and shut down the main Bolshevik newspaper, Rabochi Put.
A provocation.
A fatal one. Trotsky and the MRC leadership jumped on it immediately. This was the government attacking the Soviet, attacking the revolution.
So the MRC could frame its response as defense.
Precisely. Within hours, troops loyal to the MRC Lithuanian Guards, I think, confronted the cadets, tore down the government seals, and reopened the printing press. Then the MRC started issuing orders.
Taking over the city's nerve centers.
Systematically. MRC commissars were sent to seize the central post office, the telephone exchange. They actually cut the power to the Winter Palace and government buildings.
Smart.
Nikolaevsky Railway Station to control troop movements, the Petrograd Telegraph Agency to control the news, and of course the cruiser Aurora.
The famous ship. What was its role?
Its radicalized crew was ordered by the MRC to move up the Neva River, near the Nikolaevsky Bridge. Its presence, maybe its searchlights, was enough to intimidate the government cadets guarding the bridge into withdrawing. No shots fired there initially.
And what's striking is how, well, calm parts of the city remained during all this.
It's bizarre, isn't it? Sources talk about restaurants, cinemas, theaters being open and operating as usual on the evening of the 24th, even as strategic points were falling. A real sense of unreality, as one observer put it.
So the revolution unfolds almost invisibly in some ways. What about the Winter Palace, the seat of government?
That came on the 25th. Kerensky himself had already fled earlier, trying to rally loyal troops from the front. He left his cabinet ministers behind.
Who was defending them?
Not many. Mostly military cadets, junkers, they were called, and elements of the Women's Shock Battalion. They were outnumbered and morale was low.
Was the storming as dramatic as it often depicted?
Not really, no. It was actually quite chaotic and, frankly, a bit disorganized. There's a famous story about the Bolsheviks trying to get the cannons ready in the Peter and Paul Fortress across the river to fire on the palace.
Yeah.
They found the guns hadn't been cleaned, parts were missing. They couldn't even find the red lantern they were supposed to use as a signal. It was a bit of a mess.
So less of a heroic assault, more of a gradual infiltration.
Much more like that. Small groups slipped in, guards drifted away or surrendered. Antonov Ovsenko, who led the final arrest, admitted the attack was completely unorganized. Eventually, the remaining defenders gave up.
And the ministers?
Arrested. Taken across the river to the Peter and Paul Fortress, ironically to the same damp cells in the Trubetskoy Bastion where Tsarist ministers had been held after February.
The wheel turns. Okay, government overthrown. But the political battle isn't over, is it? It shifts immediately to the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which is opening right as this is happening.
Exactly. The timing was crucial. News of the Winter Palace falling arrived during the Congress's first session on the night of the 25th.
Was there any attempt at compromise now?
There was a brief moment. Martov, leader of the Bolshevik Internationalists, a left-wing Bolshevik faction, he immediately proposed stopping the fighting and negotiating to form a broad coalition government of all the parties in the Soviet.
And how did that go down?
Initially, it was approved by acclamation. There was still hope for a united socialist front, maybe forcing the Bolsheviks to share power.
Okay.
But the mainstream Mensheviks and the right SR delegates were absolutely furious. They saw the Bolshevik seizure of power before the Congress could decide as an outrageous coup and an insane adventure.
So they protested.
Vehemently. They delivered scathing speeches condemning the Bolsheviks, and then they walked out.
They walked out. Why?
They declared they wouldn't legitimize the Bolsheviks' actions or take responsibility for the consequences. They thought they were isolating the Bolsheviks, making a principled stand. That was a catastrophic mistake, wasn't it? Absolutely fatal. Trotsky famously seized the moment, shouting after them something like, "Go where you belong, into the dustbin of history." Their walkout removed the main opposition within the Congress.
So by leaving, they handed the Bolsheviks and their allies, the left SRs, complete control of the Congress.
Precisely. It cleansed the Congress of counter-revolutionary influences, as Trotsky put it. It allowed the Bolsheviks to claim the mandate of the Soviets without serious challenge inside the hall.
And with the opposition gone.
Kamenev formally announced the arrest of the provisional government. Lenin, making his first public appearance in months, came forward to thunderous applause, declaring, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." The Bolshevik government was ratified.
Was there any immediate armed resistance after that?
Some, but limited and quickly dealt with. An anti-Bolshevik committee for the salvation of the country and revolution formed, including cadets, Mensheviks, SRs. They organized a small uprising of military cadets in Petrograd on October 29th.
How did that go?
Crushed fairly quickly by forces loyal to the MRC. A bigger threat, actually, came from the All-Russian Union of Railway Workers, Vikshal.
Why them?
They controlled the railways nationally. They threatened a crippling general strike unless the Bolsheviks formed a broad socialist coalition. That forced the Bolsheviks into negotiations for a while, showing their initial grip wasn't totally secure. But the immediate military threat in Petrograd was overcome.
Okay, so connecting the dots here. The Bolshevik success seems rooted, firstly, in the sheer popular appeal of simple, powerful slogans. Peace, land, and bread.
Absolutely. And that crucial slogan, "All power to the Soviets," which, again, for many people on the ground, meant a responsive, democratic, all-socialist government, not necessarily one-party rule initially.
And the other key factor seems less about Bolshevik genius, maybe, and more about the complete and utter collapse of the provisional government's credibility.
Definitely. The PG's failure to end the war, fix the economy, or deliver land reform created a vacuum. The relentless economic despair pushed people towards anyone offering a radical alternative. The Bolsheviks were, in many ways, the beneficiaries of that systemic failure.
Which brings us to a final thought, maybe a bit provocative. We often picture revolution as this huge, bloody, climactic battle. But the actual takeover in Petrograd, the seizure of power itself, was relatively quick, strategically executed, and surprisingly bloodless in the grand scheme of things.
Compared to what came later, yes.
So perhaps the irony is that the hardest fight for the Bolsheviks in those crucial months wasn't necessarily against the dying provisional government.
But against each other.
Exactly. Fighting internally over whether they even dared to take power at all. The hesitation versus Lenin's relentless push, that internal struggle might have been just as critical as the external one.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. The battle within the party as the prelude to the battle for the state.